I wonder if he speaks like an ordinary guy.
I know him, and he does.
And you're my fact-checking cub.
A bulk of my Rush listening occurred on a plane ride back from vacation, a 7-hour flight that afforded me the time to actually pay attention as I listened. The cabin turned an otherworldly purplish color as I listened to Fly By Night, which seemed appropriate. It seems that Rush is a band that needs to be paid attention to, meaning it's not something I would throw on while washing clothes or barbecuing. Rush demands attention, whether you're a fan or not. Hello, and welcome to the Pop Culture Basement Podcast. My name is Mike Jamison, and with me tonight is returning guest from the History on Film podcast, Ross Lennon. Ross, how are you tonight?
Like Brigadoon or Narnia, I am back in the basement. I've wanted back in since I left, and I'm so happy to be back. Thank you so much. And about my favorite topic, too.
I had the door locked, and I heard somebody pulling on the doorknob and turning the knob, and I was like, is that Ross, or is that just one of my kids trying to get down here? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, before we get into the topic itself, I feel like we have to talk about the history of just making this episode.
Okay.
When we started it, it was, of course, going to be me and my close friend and colleague, Ryan, and at that point, Rush was, this fantastic band. Now, we've gone so long that Rush is this band that's getting ready to tour again. So much has happened in the world of this group. They have a new drummer. They are going back on tour after, retiring almost 10 years ago at this point. It's a good time to be a Rush fan. It's an exciting time. And I want to talk about, I think, what makes them so special. I was taking furious notes when you did your Billboard Top 50 list episode about all the things that I wanted to say if I was in the room. And the fact that Rush wasn't even on there at all, were they?
No, they weren't.
Yeah, we don't have time to litigate all of that. I have some other points I want to make later, but you cannot tell the story of rock and roll without talking about Rush, and I think they are so influential not just on music, because Rush may not be your favorite band, but they're your favorite band's favorite band. And I think that they tell so much of this story of modern culture. I want to talk about fandom, that you cannot talk about a lot of popular culture and nerd culture without, dipping your toe into this band.
It's very fortuitous, you are correct, that we waited so long and got through the many, many obstacles that it took to finally record this episode. If people haven't figured out that we're going to be talking about Rush, that is who we're going to be talking about tonight. Yes, the band Rush. And before we started to record tonight, I had messaged you a couple of hours ago and said, hey, I'm going to be a little bit late to record, maybe about 10 to 15 minutes. I have to go pick up my son. And you had said, that's great, because it gives me more time to write more. And I just thought, yes, you know what? I'm not gonna have any problem getting Ross to talk about this subject tonight. And what you brought up is very true. I was aware of Rush. I've been aware of Rush, just being a rock fan and being a fan of pop culture in general. But I was never the biggest fan, or really a fan at all. I know the songs, and I could say I know the hits, most of them. There were some, and we'll get into it when we're talking about some of the songs and some of the albums. There were some songs that when I heard them, I said to myself, oh, that was Rush. I didn't even realize that was Rush. I know this song. I didn't realize it was them. So you had brought this up right after we'd recorded the Pokemon episode, my second episode of the Pop Culture Basement podcast. After we had completed, you had said to me, I want to come on and I want to talk about Rush. And yes, it's taken a while to finally make this happen, but you had kept on every couple of weeks, every couple of months saying, we need to make this happen. We need to make this happen. So now that we're here, we're doing it. I have hit record, so I know that our voices are being recorded. I need you to tell me off the bat, how did your fandom start? And then talk about the overall fandom that surrounds the band Rush.
So I got into them, I would say probably in high school. I was listening to a lot of, like what we now call classic rock, what we called then classic rock as well, but I don't think Rush classifies as classic rock. And I think, especially now, that had not quite a derogatory context to it, but it's like when you say classic rock, you can definitely say it in a way that's like classic rock. And like you kind of get an idea of who and what you're talking about. Rush is so much different than that. But basically, I went to my first concert and I was like, oh, I know the hits. I was going to a lot of concerts at that time in my life. And after going to the first concert, I was just like, holy moly, there's so much to get into. All these songs are great. And it was just such a unique experience compared to all of the other concerts that I was going to. And I think being in that environment is what made me really want to commit.
How did you go? Did you go with a friend? Did you just decide
Yeah,
yourself?
I went with one of my closest friends, and my aunt drove us.
Okay.
So that was a lot of fun, and I think I have seen them 8 times in total, with different iterations of basically all of my closest friends, um, including Ryan for a few of them. But it's one of those things where, and I've been to a lot of rock concerts, a lot of different kinds of concerts. It is the only time where you show up and you feel like you are friends with everybody there. Like you can engage in conversation very easily. Like it just feels like different versions of your friend group all organized like in one stadium basically. Like it's a very like we talk about like in the Lord of the Rings movies as like a positive example of masculinity. I feel like the sort of like male friendships at a Rush concert are like sort of the right way to be buddies. And I think that shows up in a lot of the ways that like Rush is depicted in media, which we'll get to as well.
Yeah,
But
I think they're a very Canadian band, and I mean that as a
definitely,
compliment. They're a very, very Canadian band, very polite, very nice boys. Even not being a huge fan of the band, I did watch, and this was even before we had talked about doing this podcast. I had watched the documentary uh, on Rush that was made, I think around 10, maybe 10, 15 years ago.
yeah, beyond the lighted stage,
Yes.
and we're not going to go through that beat by beat, but I think that is definitely a great example
I think
of
it
something.
shows much to what you were just talking about, the fandom and how the fandom. I think if you do get into this band and you like this band, that the fandom will embrace you, and it does look like a very welcoming type of fan base. Because, as you said, Rush, I understand what you're saying, that they're okay. They're not a classic band. They fall into the classic rock category
Yeah,
because of when their music came out and when they were the most popular. But they as a band, even from the very beginning and even now with that classification, have always been on the outside looking in. I think they're very much the outsiders, and their fans, and I don't want to speak for them, you can do that a little bit better, feel like the outsiders also. So when, much like we say with a lot of fandoms, when you find your people, it's always great to find your people. And I think Rush fans, when they get into that fandom, feel like they have found their people.
yeah, I definitely think that's what it is. And just to sort of button up like the idea of classic rock, like I definitely think because of when they started and that first decade of hits, like they have a lot of songs that are in rotation on classic rock radio stations more than most bands. When you think about it, like you can name like 6 or 7 songs that you can expect to hear like on a classic rock drive time station. um but just like Steely Dan and Blue Oyster Cult, and like there's some other bands where it's like they're a little bit more broad than that. There's a lot of bands where it's like, well, they had 1 or 2 big albums in the 70s and they kind of live on, excuse me, as classic rock, as opposed to like Rush over the run of their career has evolved and their fandom enjoys the new music just as much as the old stuff. Usually, if you want to make 1,000 people have to go pee at the same time, you say this next one's off our latest album.
Sure.
But with Rush fans, maybe they have their preferences. But it's like everybody likes all of it, to some degree. And I think that's something that's very special because you see them grow and evolve, as a group, and sort of the sound changes and evolves in all these interesting kinds of ways. But it's not, there's no, Chinese democracy or anything like that where it's
I mean, I went and saw Paul McCartney, and this was 1994, and he's playing the Beatles hits, he's playing his solo hits and the hits with wings. As soon as he basically said, "This is from the new album," that's when everybody was like, "I'm going to the bathroom, I'm going to go get a beer." I think Rush, and I keep saying I think because you are the major fan. I am just the outsider looking in, but it seems to me with Rush is that if you go, much like you said, you went to the concert, and luckily for you, you found something that you loved. And I think most fans, if you are a huge fan of Rush, well, that is their experience, that you most likely like it all and you want to experience it all. You don't want to have those songs that, all right, now I'm going to leave because this is off the new album. No, you want the new album and you want to get the whole experience with them. And I think that's very rare, and I think that's another reason why I think that Rush fandom feels like their own little tribe. And it's not something as you said, I don't think it's something that an outsider would feel like they couldn't penetrate, because I think it's very much welcoming. Like, come and experience this. Come and see what we get to like, and maybe you'll like it too, which is very different also.
And stylistically, it's a great bridge between sort of like progressive rock and like the Yes and stuff of the 70s with like a lot of the metal and like even progressive metal. I don't have a game this time, but I did bring a list of recommendations, sort of, tacking to the different phases of Rush's sound.
Well, that's good, because for this podcast and for my research, I basically listened to all of Rush's discography. I never listened to a full Rush album before in my life, before I did this a couple months ago. And I do notice that with them. I mean, they started very much in the early 70s with that blues-based kind of rock that was almost everything that was coming out of the 60s into the early 70s sounded like that. And you watch it evolve over the 70s into that, as you said, a little bit. I think they fall sometimes into that category with Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer into that progressive type of rock. But when they got into the early 80s, and they're one of those bands that they're very much a cult band. They had minor hits, but when they got into when the 80s started, and wasn't the middle of their career, but 6, 7, 8 years on is when they finally hit, and that's when their sound progressed again, and they got a little bit more of a metal sound, but also keyboards.
Yeah, they get very synth heavy going into the 80s, and that's the thing, is that they're always adding to the repertoire. And it's like, it's so great because you can see like where they're sort of not influencing themselves, but it's like they're bringing what other people are doing into their craft. And there are very few bands that are willing to evolve like that over the course of time. And I think that, I'll talk about some of those bands later, but, I just to sort of touch on what you had said earlier, they have, self-described themselves, and, writers have said this as well, like that they're the biggest cult band. Or Geddy, the lead singer, said, we're not mainstream, but we're a big stream next to the mainstream, which is something that I think is, pretty apt, because it's like, they have always existed. People have always known, like, oh, I understand what it means when somebody says that they're a Rush fan. But I think in terms of their popularity and sort of like their Q score, where it's like how resonant they are in culture, I think it was towards the end of their first run like in like the late 2000s is when is when they were really sort of getting their accolades. So I think that a lot of their popularity sort of like as fandom and sort of like niche fandom and nerd culture has become more mainstream, Rush has become more mainstream, and a lot of popular creatives and a lot of, well respected people in entertainment are themselves Rush fans, and you start to see it a lot when you watch stuff like I Love You Man or
Hmm.
Archer or The Simpsons, or like you start to see, or South Park. One of the great things about going to a Rush concert is they get all of these people who want to contribute. So like Rick Moranis and Doug and Dave Thomas did a Great White North reunion for the Time Machine Tour or Snakes and Arrows. So 2007, 2008, Rick Moranis had been retired for a long time, but him and you know Bob and his brother Doug did a video introducing a song. The Trailer Park Boys have had a few Rush crossovers, so it's like you see where this stuff is sort of entwining with a lot of popular culture, and as nerd culture became more popular, it sort of became more like prominent to talk about Rush fandom, and we'll get into that in a minute.
Well,
But
yeah, that was actually going to be my next question to you. Is do you think that it is appropriate to label them as nerd rock? And it's funny to watch because as I was listening to the albums, I would watch a couple videos, especially from the '70s, and they're very '70s videos, which I love because it's, it's such lo-fi special effects, just a lot of smoke machines and bad lighting. But I mean, Rush fell into some of the tropes. I mean, the wide open shirts and collars, but you could tell it never really fit them. And I
yeah,
mean, listen, Led Zeppelin had lyrics that were inspired by Lord of the Rings, but so did Rush. And I think if and I know that that Led Zeppelin they were fans of the Lord of the Rings, but I feel like if you met Rush, they would actually be reading Lord of the Rings backstage, and you could talk to them about it a lot more than you could with Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. So yeah, what do you think about? I think Rush themselves, I think the band themselves would take that as a badge of honor, and I think the fans probably would also. But again, I do not want to speak for the fans, so I'm going to have Ross you speak for the fans. So tell me, what would the fans say?
yeah. I think nerd rock is sort of like math rock, where it has like a legal definition, so it doesn't fall into that. I think that progressive metal is a very nerdy genre of music. I have a background in music theory. I'm bad at it, so I know how hard it is. So it's like I think they have a lot of fans who are nerds of other kinds of stuff. And so whether you say like, oh, they have songs about, evolutionary biology, or they have songs about this or that, or my cousin is a brilliant engineer. I do not understand the world of engineering and physics and stuff like that, and he's like, oh, this song is about what I do. And it's like, these are guys who didn't finish high school because they wanted to start a music career, and this brilliant engineer is like, oh, that's what I do for a living. And it's like, what the hell?
When I was delving deep into it, that was what I was not nervous about because I was actually looking forward to listening to full albums and seeing what they were all about because, as you said, especially over, I would say, the last 15, 20 years, Rush, I feel like they have been dragged and not kicking and screaming because I'm sure they're happy because it helps album sales and it helps to give them more exposure, but you just hear more about them. And it is because of more famous fans now coming out with their Rush fandom and putting them into various pop culture projects, be it movies, be it other artists who like them. And you're gonna rattle off the whole list, but it's very true what you said. It's your favorite band's favorite band. I know, I mean, I'll say off the top of my head, Dave Grohl is somebody who is always saying how much of a Rush fan he is. Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins talks about his Rush fandom. So, yeah, I think you're right. You have they it's just one of those bands. I'm not going to say it's on the same level, but Queen is one of those bands also that, I mean, sure, they've always been big, but because of pop culture, I think they've always stayed in the spotlight, and they'll dip every couple of years, but then all of a sudden, 5 years later, oh, people are listening and talking about Queen again. I don't think Rush is on that same level, but I do think that people talk about them more now than they ever did. Even when I graduated high school in 1992, I knew who Rush was, but I don't think they were one of the driving forces in pop culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were moments in their early career where they had a lot of success, and that sort of looked the same way that a lot of bands would have like a hit album or whatever. But rather than, hitting it big and then plateauing or breaking up or whatever, they continued to do their own thing. And to go back to like the flowy shirts and the kimonos and stuff like that, that was something that the record label had wanted them to do early on in their career, where they're like, no, you have to dress like Led Zeppelin and do all this, artsy fartsy stuff. And they're like, we don't want to do that. We want to wear t-shirts and jeans and just, play music. And basically they got to a point eventually where they were successful enough that they were able to do their own thing, but not so successful. Like, I don't want to say not so successful, but it's like, once the record company realized that they could be left to their own devices, and do their own thing, then that is what happened. But, yeah, for decades now, it's been like, well, we're going to do our own thing. And this comes back to something that I talk about a lot when I do fandom studies. It's like, the right people will find it and get into it. So, are you a Misty? I don't know if we've ever talked about
Mystery Science Theater 3000. Yeah. I don't think I could be. Well, here I will ask you, because I'm.
Is that what I'm coming on to talk about next?
Maybe I would assume you are now.
Yes.
Here, you judge my fandom. My history with Mystery Science Theater 3000, when Comedy Central debuted as the Comedy Channel in 1989, we had just gotten cable in 1989. And in 89-90, that was added to our cable lineup. And my brother and I used to stay up all night. If you're going to come on to do Mystery Science Theater 3000, you should just come on and do a Comedy Channel episode, because my brother and I would stay up and watch not only Mystery Science Theater 3000, but we would watch all of those original Comedy Channel shows. That was back when Comedy Channel wanted to be MTV, so they would show clips of stand-up comedians. That's how I knew who Jerry Seinfeld was. That's how I discovered Colin Quinn or Norm Macdonald. I can remember Norm Macdonald before he was on Saturday Night Live. When he was on Saturday Night Live, I would say, oh, that's the guy that I used to see clips of on Comedy Channel. But they also had their own shows, much like MTV had VJs. Comedy Channel had hosts that they would have they would kind of do interstitial skits in between clips. And they had Higgins Boys and Gruber was one show. They had Rachel Sweet. They used to have their own late night talk show called Night After Night with Alan Havey. I think my brother and I are the only ones who, if we say the Mobley Hotel, know what we're talking about. Because I was in high school. He was probably in 8th grade. Friday and Saturday nights, we were nerds. We weren't out. We were sitting at home watching either MTV or the Comedy Channel. So that's the roundabout way to say we used to watch MST 3K all the time. Now, I joined the fan group because I remember, this was, again, the early 90s, so I got it in the mail, and you would get letters and all that kind of stuff. So I watched it for a couple of years. When Mike came on, I didn't like him as much as Joel. I know you're going to get mad. So I didn't watch it as much, and then I was out of high school, and I was on to college, but I kind of drifted away. But I would still, if it was on and I just had the TV on, I would put it on. There's always one episode, and maybe you'll know because you're probably a bigger fan than I was. It was a movie, and they were supposed to be teenagers, but you could tell it was filmed in the 50s.
That's
It was
what I'm
supposed to be
writing about.
They were supposed to be
Is what-
teenagers, but you could tell they were older, and they just kept clowning on how old they looked, and they were supposed to be teenagers. And I remember, I think it was Servo just saying, "Oh, to be 40 again."
I mean, the crazy thing is that that doesn't narrow it down at all.
Yeah, I know.
I'm writing a book about movies from the teenagers in the 50s who were all played by, old ass dudes.
And it hasn't changed, but back then they looked their age. Now you
Yeah.
could kind of get away with it, but yeah, back then you looked like you were about 35 when they were playing 16-year-olds. So that's to say, I did love Mystery Science Theater, but I never became I'm probably not the definition of a Misty.
Well, I ask because they had that same ethos of we're going to make what we like, and the right people will find it, and the right people will enjoy it. And that is, I think, probably the best way to describe Rush as well, where it's like, you find a lane, you stick to it, and you continue to grow and evolve and do all of these, really incredible things. And I think that is the best way to wind this into the, sort of the meat that I had come on to talk about, which is fandom studies. Because I think this is something that I have certainly gotten much more interested in the last couple of years. And I think it is sort of a skeleton key for understanding a lot of popular culture of certainly the last 30 years. But really, I think even going back to Star Wars and Jaws and the dawning of the blockbuster era and IP and all this other kind of stuff, I think that fandom studies, for people who might think it sounds like kind of a woo, artsy fartsy, underwater basket weaving subject, it's no, it's a pretty great lens for looking at a lot of, social and cultural life. Fandom studies is an academic field that looks specifically at how people engage with culture and reinterpret it. It started to gain momentum in academic circles in the 1980s, 1990s, but obviously fandom is much older than that. You had Listomania, you had I Like Ike, fandom is an old thing. It's just that we start to talk about it in the 80s and 90s as, scholars are like, well, I'm really into Star Trek, maybe I should write about how it's not just a show, it's a community, and, we reinterpret it this way and that way.
I would also say, and you can, because you are more the expert on this than I am, I think it's how we consume pop culture, and that's one of the questions I always ask when I have first-time guests on, how did you consume pop culture growing up? And it's as the media changes. I mean, everybody thinks of Beatlemania, and for me in the 90s, getting into the Beatles, saying, wow, I would have loved to have lived during then, because they'd never seen a phenomenon like that. But then you learn that Frank Sinatra was really the first teen idol, and it had gone from Frank Sinatra to Elvis to Frankie Valli, and then Frankie Avalon, and
I
then the
was writing
Beatles.
about Annette and Frankie today.
There you go. And so it's and now, as you said, in the 80s, especially after Star Wars and Jaws, the dawn of the blockbuster, and the 80s especially with Spielberg, the decade of Spielberg, and his footprint that he put onto pop culture and the kind of movies that we started to get in the 80s into the 90s. And you're probably going to get to this, going into the 2000s and the dawn of the internet, and fandom having more of a direct way to interact with not only other fans, but with the creators and the studios who are bankrolling these creators. That leads to some not so great things that have now, in 2025, we see what that has wrought, not only in entertainment, but in society as a whole.
Well, and yeah, you're nailing it right off the bat, because of course this all gets supercharged with the advent of the internet. We've talked a lot about on my show, the X-Files, as sort of an early internet fandom. We did an episode on Magic the Gathering as an early internet fandom, and the ways in which people who are creating work are able to engage with the people responding to their work in ways that was not previously possible at that speed and scale. Um, and so much of the ways that we have since structured social engagement online is influenced by fandom. Uh, Early Usenet boards, for people who are old enough to remember, the pre sort of like the early internet was, these Usenet bulletin boards basically.
Well, you're bringing that up. I mean, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting
Oh
you.
no,
I
okay.
know famously they talk about before email was even widely known that there were fans talking about Return of the Jedi right after it was released and bitching and complaining about it even back then. So this is not a new phenomenon. It's just now everybody knows about it. Back then it was 4, 5, 6, or 7 people who actually knew what this crazy weird email thing was, and they used this magical new tool to talk about their dissatisfaction with Ewoks.
Yeah, but like the Usenet boards, like it was structured based on interest.
Mhm.
And then you go to stuff like forums and message boards, and then Reddit or communities on Tumblr and TikTok, where people say like, "Oh, this is book talk. This is politic, whatever." Like these sort of self-selecting communities. Um, and I just want to mention, because like I said, this might sound pretty loosey-goosey to some people, but this framework for studying fandom is pretty important, and I'll give you two what I think are pretty softball examples. So the first one is pretty obvious. Taylor Swift, the globe-striding colossus. Anytime she blows her nose, she has fans doing numerology and posting online about it. Oh, what does this mean? What does this mean? Like, I am not a fan of her music. I respect the fact that, at least in the beginning, she was writing her own songs. But she has structured her career around engaging with fandom and encouraging the growth of her fandom. And I think that the way that that was done was very savvy. I don't know all the ins and outs of how it was done, but I think that the fact that she has endured for, oh gosh, almost 20 years now is a testament to the fact that I feel like that was very fan forward at a time that wasn't necessarily as sophisticated as it is, done now. And the other much less fun example is looking at fandom as it relates to political movements. We don't have to get into that tonight.
It's okay.
But I will say that it has significant overlap. If you think about perhaps, supporters of one political party as being fans rather than, rational, cold-minded observers of the political ecosystem, then you might see like, oh, well, if I look at it through this lens of people who are, fans of someone or something, then it just gives us better language to analyze and discuss it. And that's not new either. Like I said, I like Ike. The political parties of the 1800s were parties. Like, you would get people together to vote, and it was like a day of drinking. So again,
And as you just said, it's not that political discourse isn't new, and discourse like this online isn't new. I think people, especially over the last 10 years, Twitter has evolved into, and this is my personal opinion, a cesspool of unsubstantiated rumors that people can run with. It's not it's not something new. It was just different ways. My one of my when I first really started getting onto the internet and looking up movies and wanting to follow movies, the first website I went to was Ain't It Cool News. And Ain't It Cool News at first was thought of as a way for fans to talk. And, a lot of these fans, and not even I in 1999, it thought, oh, well, this is for true movie fans because that's how people are going to think. But it evolved into, and studios started to change the way they were making movies because they would see how fans on message boards on Ain't It Cool News were talking about what these movies were going to be because there were spies, this isn't like James Bond, but there were spies who were either getting hold of early scripts or were taking pictures on sets, and then fans were reacting to them in real time, and then studios in real time were changing plans because of this. And at first, it made Ain't It Cool News followers seem very powerful because, hey, look at this. Yes, we're telling studios what to do, but as that again evolved and went on, it started to fall apart, much like I think discourse does now on Twitter, and became something a little bit more toxic. And I mean that can be a whole another episode also, just the rise and fall of Ain't It Cool News. But as you said, these things aren't new. It's just the way now that we go about doing them, and the technology and the media that we have at our fingertips, and that we're able to use to be fans and to meet other fans and to engage with the things that we're fans of.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about like these new or burgeoning fields, a lot of times it's just we're giving new language, new vocabulary to things that we have already observed elsewhere. We just want to be able to talk about in a more like streamlined and concise way. And so that's fandom studies, like I said, is at a real big blow up over the last 30 or so years. And I think when you really start to think about it, it makes a lot of obvious sense in hindsight. But I bring all of that up because one of the unique things about Rush is that they really created this incredible fan culture, like I said, very much either by accident or unintentionally, I would say. But they did it sort of as this field of study is beginning to form. So a lot of people didn't have that vocabulary to describe it, especially outside of academia. And they did it, for the first couple of decades without the benefit of the internet. It was just people, finding this group, networking, and just becoming devoted to this group. And what is so interesting to me as a longtime Rush fan, because I definitely consider myself in this group of people that we're talking about, is two things. Number one, we kind of hit on this already, a lot of Rush fans show up in other fandoms, especially some of the nerdy properties that would have been popular in the 70s and 80s. Star Wars, Star Trek, D&D, etc. So I think when you engage in one form of fandom, it's easier to branch out and be involved with others. So I think because we had Star Trek fandom, because we had Battlestar Galactica fandom, D&D, whatever, I think Rush was able to cross-pollinate in those groups, because if you're meeting to talk about Dungeons and Dragons or Star Trek, well, you're going to listen to Rush in the car. I've driven all across this great country of ours listening to Rush going to play in Magic the Gathering tournaments with people who themselves are like, oh yeah, I really like this song. So I think that because those fandoms had maybe more infrastructure to them, that I think that is maybe one way. And this is all, that's sort of a guess on my part. But it makes sense, so we're going to go with it. But the other thing that fascinates me is that Rush fandom, as sort of a cultural signifier, or like an identity, didn't peak, like I had mentioned earlier, in the 70s or 80s. It peaked in the 2000s and early 2010s. So the idea of Rush fans as draw a cartoon in your head of a Rush fan really meant something significant in that later period of their career. And that's really intriguing to me. And it's not just guys like we talked about with classic rock, where it's like someone fixing a Trans Am in 1984. That's not the cartoon in your head of a Rush fan. It's Marshall on How I Met Your Mother. It's Dr. Krieger on Archer. It's Bubbles on Trailer Park Boys. Not to mention all of the other ways, that these creators pay tribute to Rush in their work. Stephen Colbert, when he was doing the Colbert Report on Comedy Central, he actually got the band and dedicated a whole hour to having them on, talking about them. I think it was for the Time Machine tour, or maybe it was for Snakes and Arrows, but they didn't do a lot of TV, especially then. And he basically booked them and like made the whole hour about Rush. And me and my friends had a big party to watch it. And
that's
a
interesting.
lot of other bands don't have that.
That's interesting that you're saying that because now thinking about it, they've never been on SNL, right? They're not really a band that would go on Letterman back in the 90s when Letterman and Leno and the late night wars were going on, and as a band, you would want to go on there to get your music out there. They have built their fandom up, and this coincides with what you're talking about. They built their fandom up in many ways in the traditional way in that they toured and toured, and they got very big in Canada. They're Canadian, famously, as I brought up. They're good Canadian boys. Got big in Canada, and was it Cleveland? Was it a station in Cleveland that played that started playing Working Man? That really kind of broke them in America, and that was very much in the '70s, especially. That was the way before MTV. You just toured. It's always fun. And reading about them also as I was listening to all their records, but reading more about them. It's always great to see the bands that toured together back in the 70s because you just toured. You just went out and it didn't matter. So it would be Rush and Kiss opening for Barry Manilow. It would be John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Aerosmith opening up for Leonard Skinner. So as a band in the 70s like Rush that was just trying to break through, you're going to take whatever you can. You're going to open for whoever you can open for. And then when you get that break, when you have a station somewhere in a bigger city start playing your stuff, you're going to take that, and then the record label is going to say, okay, now we're going to make sure we're touring in America, and you're going to open for whoever, and you're going to get out there, and you're going to go. So that's another way just of, as a rock band, you're going to build your audience, and you're going to, before all of this came later with the fans and with more famous celebrities kind of carrying the Rush flag. They were just out there as a working band trying to break through, and they did it in that old-fashioned kind of. They weren't a band that, as we brought up and as you have said, that put out their first album and hit automatically, sold 10 million copies, and were huge, and then kind of dipped in popularity. No, it was building, and they're a band that found their stride and found their popularity midway through their career, and then it kept going from there. But even after that, they were never a band that you would always see on MTV. They're a band that they relied on their fandom to come out for their concerts and to have their fans especially buy their albums and to keep them going.
Similar to the Beatles, like they sort of like grinded out a bunch of shows when they were very, very young, like before even their first album. Like they just had a ton of reps, like playing local shows. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the first album was popular in 1975. And like you had mentioned, like Working Man got played in Cleveland. That's how, prior to MTV, you would introduce new music was, I forget the call sign, but it was like this Cleveland station sort of was like the bellwether for whether a band would take off or not.
Yeah, every big city has. Philadelphia still has one rock station that is not corporate. It's not computerized DJs playing music. That has always been the rock. It's the rock station. It's WMMR in Philadelphia. That famously Billy Joel did studio sessions live in 1972 and played Captain Jack, and that station started to play Captain Jack, which made him big in Philadelphia and started to get him going on the East Coast. I mean, Springsteen is they were one of the early stations to champion Bruce Springsteen. So yeah, back in the 70s, that's how you did it. That's how you broke. You had a rock station in a bigger city play your song, play your album, play a track from your album, and if it caught on, then okay, we got something.
It's one of those things where it's like the numbers and the sort of sales metrics and all this other kind of stuff, it's so sophisticated now. So it's like, we may look back, like I always think of like Arrested Development when it was on, oh, the show's getting no ratings. Well, it was because they didn't know how to incorporate TiVo into the ratings. and then you go back and you're like, oh, this was the third highest watched show on television. It was just that the measurements were not meeting the moment. I do wonder how much of Rush's early success and sort of stuff like that was just the methods not meeting the moment. Because they've sold out shows for almost 50 years now. And when they announced this new tour with the new drummer, Annika Nilis, tickets were flying off the shelves, basically. So the demand is still there for a sense that like a lot of legacy acts, we would call them now, don't really like do those numbers. And so I think it's hard for me to say, especially for the parts where I wasn't alive, that like, oh, popularity dipped or waned or whatever. They certainly have their very orchestral, sort of period where they're like doing these 20-minute songs. And I think that's hard to play on the radio. But I think that it would not surprise. I mean, they're one of the highest grossing bands of all time. And you don't get that way by accident. I think it's just that there's perception of them as this sort of niche, big stream next to the mainstream thing is something that people will look back and be like, yeah, but they were selling a ton of records. Like, they just didn't get this, the same kind of respect because they're making music for weird uncles as opposed to, whoever is buying records.
Hey, weird uncles need to listen to music too.
They do.
The misconception that I had when I started to delve into their discography was, oh, I'm going to listen to these albums and it's going to be a 20-minute side song suite. And that is not something that I'm really that into. I mean, I say it to everybody. I like any kind of music. I'm mostly a rock and roll person, but I will try jazz, I'll try classical, I will try regular pop. If it's good, it's good. I've come to that age now where it doesn't matter. I like what I like, and I don't care. I'm not 19 and have to be, yes, I'm a rock and roll guy, man. So, as I said, I was interested to listen, but it was also, I was a little wary because I said to myself, am I in for 45 minutes of an instrumental? Because that's not me. And it's not 45 minutes of an instrument. Maybe in the concert it is. Yeah, that was even something with the Grateful Dead. I always was opposed to listening to the Grateful Dead because I know their live shows, fans would say, it's 5 hours and 3 of them are like one jam. And I'm like, okay, I'm not taking any mind-altering drugs, so that's not really what I'm into. But finally, I got into them over the past year. So listening to Rush, I was like, okay, some of this I do like. And then some of it, I did find, okay, this is a little too sci-fi, Lord of the Rings, fantasy stuff for me. But for me, it might not have worked. But hey, I'm not going to yuck anybody else's yum.
Yeah, well, we're bearing the lead here. What did you think? I want your sort of broader notes, and then I want to know sort of what stuff you locked in on.
Well, that's good, because then I'm going to ask you what period, as a bigger Rush fan, I want to ask you what your favorite maybe period is and what your favorite albums are. But for me, I found their earlier, I'd say, stuff from the 70s to be a little bit more distant. And then I found their 80s stuff on to be a little bit more accessible. Now, that doesn't mean that I like the 80s stuff more than the 70s material, because as much as I just said, oh, I like all kinds of music, growing up, the first big rock band that I liked was Aerosmith. So getting into them in 1989, I said to myself, oh, I want to go back and listen. And I really like their 70s stuff. So I was always into that kind of dirty, bluesy kind of classic rock. I like their I think their first album is actually very good, which is, it's it's weird to say because Neil Peart is not the drummer for that album. But their first couple of albums, when they're a little bit more, I would almost say, down to earth, it's before they get a little bit more cosmic and a little bit more experimental. and it's before they become what Rush is known for. I found, and possibly because I'm not that big of a fan, I found it easier to listen to that because it's a lot more straightforward rock
Yeah.
than some of their later stuff. But I was not turned off by then their more experimental material. There were albums that I would go back to, but when I then started to get into the early 80s stuff, and I knew that they got more into the synthesizers, I thought to myself, okay, I don't know what this is going to be like. I don't know if I'm going to enjoy this. I found myself enjoying it more than I thought I would. Now, I do think they are very much into wind. They're very much into storm sound effects. And, they're Neil Peart does tend to lean on the 70s D&D, sword and sorcery, imagery a little bit too much for my taste sometimes, and this is speaking as somebody who's a Lord of the Rings fan and all that kind of stuff. And I never thought that I would enjoy a song about being a tree, but I did. I found myself enjoying that. So I would say listening through it all, I was very pleasantly surprised, and I found myself going back and listening to more. As much as as you can tell, I'm old. I say album, and I talk about listening to albums. I still like the experience of listening to a full album. But there is one good thing about Apple and just picking songs. I can go on Apple and say, I'm going to go on the Rush. You pick the artist, and it has most played songs, and you can just put it on, and it'll, of course, have the hits. It'll have Working Man, it'll have Fly By Night, but it'll have some of the other things too. And I can just put those on, and now that I've heard them, I know, I want to listen to this, or I'm going to skip this one. I don't know. Now, I am not. It would be weird. It would probably be hard for me to become a true Rush fan because I am not the biggest live album type of guy. I do like going to concerts, but I did not listen to any of their live albums
Okay.
because I thought that would be too. I thought it would be too hard for me to get the full experience listening, as opposed to somebody like you who is a fan and has been to concerts. And that's how I think with Rush, they are truly one of the bands that, because of the nature of their fans and and fandom around the band, that you want to see them live because it is an experience. So I want to ask you, I mean, you told us how you first got into them, and now you said you have converted other friends and family members into Rush fandom. So what are your what do you consider the touchstones of your Rush fandom?
Well, so I'll just button up your point by saying that they have a lot of great live show DVDs. Sometimes that's a crapshoot, for a group, but I think those are shot so well, and they always get to incorporate, like, the late Jerry Stiller opened up the R30 tour, which I think is one of the best concert DVDs. Rush in Rio, when they did their 2-night concert in Rio de Janeiro, the first time they went to Brazil. That was an insane concert. So I would encourage you to check some of those out.
I will say, talking about DVDs, watching, and we brought it up very early, but watching Beyond the Lighted Stage, the documentary, it's a very good documentary, and I found myself, I like them personally watching. I think that's part of the fandom. They just seem like very approachable, very nice people. Maybe, and when I say approachable, and I'm saying this, maybe not Neil Peart, rest in peace, but not in a bad way. He admits in the documentary he just was somebody who, that's not what he was about. So instead of faking it or having to do it and being rude to fans, he would that is not what he would be into. But they just seem like very down-to-earth people who fame has not totally removed them from reality, and I think they do know that their bread and butter are the fans, and so they are very appreciative of what the fans do for them.
And I also think in 2026, probably one of the best forms of social capital to have is a recording of Gene Simmons saying, yeah, they didn't want to party with us after the concerts. Like, they just went into their rooms and behaved.
Yes. Well, you know what? I'm famously a big-time Kiss hater, so that actually made me like Rush even more. Good job. Good job, guys.
I go back and forth in terms of, like, what a particular... It's so hard to pick a favorite album. I've got framed copies of Signals and Moving Pictures on my wall, but really, Power Windows, I think, is one of my favorites. That's more that, like, late 80s sort of synthy albums. And Snakes and Arrows, I want to know what your thoughts of Snakes and Arrows is.
Was that their final?
It was not the final one. That
Okay.
was, I want to say Caravan, but that's not it.
But it came out when
It
did
was
Snakes and
Clockwork
Arrows-
Angels was the final one. That was the
That's right.
concept album.
Okay.
But Snakes and Arrows was 2007.
That's right.
It's,
I was gonna say, I actually enjoyed it a lot because I thought for a band that had been around, and I had just brought up, I am a big time Aerosmith fan. In 1989, Pump came out. I was 15 years old, so I was just getting into music and fell in love with that album, and then said to myself, I have all this other music I can now discover, and got into Aerosmith. But famously, after Pump, they started to fall off, and by 2011, I can't even remember the name of their last album. I didn't even buy it because there was no point in listening. They were a pale shadow of what they were, and they were obviously a band that just had to put out product to be able to go out on the road and make money touring. I thought listening to that Rush album for a band that had been around for going on 50 years, you could still see that they had creativity. And that's what I mean in that it might not be something that would always be my first choice, or that I would say, like, this is definitely, I'm going to sit down and listen to this over and over again. But you can tell that they're still wanting to find new ways of getting their music out there. They never seem to me to just be going through the motions and painting by numbers to
right.
say, we're going to go on tour, so let's just put something out there. I think they do have um, the integrity, and I think they just have that creative drive that they want to find. And they're famous for musicianship, Rush. So they're a band that's always going to be trying to find a unique type of sound for each album that they do. And I think I could tell that with that album.
Yeah, and I think the only reason I don't say that it's my favorite album is because I think that it's sort of like I have social pressure to say that it's not my favorite album, even though I think that it might actually be. And I think that when you talk about evolution, it's not that they're forgetting the stuff that they did before, it's that they're incorporating it.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that they're at the height of their powers. Geddy's voice still sounds great, and I think that, like, Far Cry is one of my favorite songs of theirs. It's such a great opener, and just I think it's a really, really great work, and it's got more of that like they're never like a power metal, like death metal,
Sure,
sort of speed metal band, but it's that progressive metal sort of with all of their other tools and skills weaved into it, and I think it's just like sort of their ideal like sound.
I will say, listening through everything, I do think that Alex Lifeson is very underrated. I do think also
100%.
I do feel bad that I think in the early 80s, as they moved into more of that synthesizer type of sound, that he got a little lost. And I think they even admit that a little bit.
Yeah.
And not that it sounds like it's not soft rock or overly poppy, but I just think that was also the sound then. So it's not that they were totally going against the grain. I mean, they used it more and used it in more unique ways, but I do feel that he did fall into the background a little bit, and I was very impressed. I mean, I was impressed with the musicianship overall. I mean, you could tell, as I said, they're famously known for their musicianship and for Geddy Lee's voice, but I did think that was one thing that really stood out, is that Alex Lifeson, I think, is a very, very underrated guitarist. When they do, you talked about the list that I did on one of my episodes, the top 50 bands. When they do lists of top 50 or top 10 guitarists, I've never seen his name on any of those lists, and I think that it's a shame that he's left off.
100%, yeah. And I think it's just that a lot of people who are writing those kinds of lists maybe don't, like, there is an expectation that Neil Peart is going to be listed in the top 10 drummers article.
Mm-hmm.
There's an expectation that Geddy Lee is going to be in the top 10 bassists. But I think for whatever reason, there's not that same expectation for Alex. And I think that he is such an incredible guitar player that when you see him open it up live, like I think it was Time Machine, maybe. Like they closed with Working Man, and the solo that he played during Working Man was just insane. And it's like, I think because the bar is higher for that instrument, rather than there are so many, run of the mill bass players, run of the mill drummers, that it's like maybe his competition level is higher, but it's
Sure.
like he is still among the elite at his instrument. So
Now, do you play an instrument, or have you played an instrument, or are you a musician?
I'm a euphonium player. So this is all just coming from my
Well,
heart.
that's okay. I was going to say because, my kids are very, very lucky. My son and my daughter both play stand-up bass, and my daughter tries to play saxophone. And they've done so in public school. I went to Catholic school growing up. I think there was one kid that played the drums. We didn't have band. I don't know anybody who played guitar. And I have a friend of mine who he played guitar and bass and wanted me to learn. And I think I plucked on the bass a couple times, and I just, and my wife plays piano. I just didn't grow up in a household that played musical instruments. So I can listen to a guitarist and think, "Oh, that's a really cool guitarist." I can listen to a drummer, and like you just said, when people are gonna bring up classic rock drummers, of course, they're gonna say, "Oh, John Bonham." They're gonna say, some people will say Ringo Starr, some people won't. Um, and they're gonna say Neil Peart because those are known, and the same thing with guitarists. They're gonna say Hendrix, they're gonna say Clapton, they're gonna say Stevie Ray Vaughan. So I think, as you said, because especially with guitarists, that there are so many uh, agreed upon great classic rock guitarists that Alex Lifeson gets lost in the mix. But for me, I can listen to Rush and I know with my untrained ears that they are working on another level musically, but I can't s- tell from experience. I just know from listening to a lot of music that okay, they're doing something a little bit different and they're doing it very, very well.
Yeah, and I think the fact that they make it look easy speaks to the technicality as
Mm,
well. Um, and just to sort of wrap up talking about Beyond the Lighted Stage, that documentary, one of the great things about it is that they incorporate so many talking heads who are respected musicians,
yep.
like David Grohl, Billy Corgan, and it's like not only is it, oh, I really liked this band when I was growing up, it's that you get the impression that these people are all impressed by the musicality of the group. And so I think that even if you and I are like, oh, I don't know, like how hard is it really? It's like when people who you respect say like this is hard and they're doing it very well, then it's like okay, it's just another sort of like validation.
And also going back to what I said about them being very down to earth, they're one of those bands that you see other rock stars meet them and they are in awe of them.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't expect somebody like Dave Grohl, who famously, and there might be some of my listeners. I know my wife at one point said, "Oh, he was in Nirvana," and I almost shriveled up and died because I felt like I was 900 years old. But Dave Grohl, who is in Nirvana, he's in Foo Fighters, in two of the biggest rock bands ever, becomes a screaming kid when he meets Rush because he's such a fan of them. And you don't see that with a lot of other bands. I mean, you see it with famously, I remember Ozzy Osbourne meeting Paul McCartney, and Ozzy Osbourne, one of the biggest rock stars in the world, meeting Paul McCartney and becoming a 10-year-old kid. And as much as I hate Kiss, you see that a lot when people meet Kiss because a lot of these rock stars grew up listening to Kiss, but you see it with Rush also. And there
100%.
you see all of these huge rock gods become 10-year-old fans again, meeting them. And I think it's funny their reaction because I think not that it makes them uncomfortable, but they're so Canadian and so nice that I think it's kind of foreign to them that these people are fawning all over them.
And just like, if I could sort of leave people with one thing, it's the idea that like it's hard for a band, especially a successful band, to make a second turn or make a third turn. They have been making all of these turns and evolutions, over the course of, the 40-year career that they had with Neil. It's the math is a little wonky because they've basically been retired for the last 10 years. So I'll just say 40-ish years. That they had really this organic growth alongside a lot of the musical trends. So you don't think of them as a 70s band or an 80s band. And that is something that's really hard to do, even for, like you said, a lot of these iconic groups like Aerosmith, where it's like, like they had sort of, maybe Aerosmith you could say had like two turns.
Yeah, famously, I think they're a band that had that they were bigger the second time when they came back, but there's very, very few. And I think that speaks to what you keep saying is that Rush was always not of the mainstream, but a little off the mainstream. They were never the biggest band in the world, but they have always been there. And that means that they can kind of rise above just being just like I said in the beginning. Yes, they're a classic, and I'm doing the air quotes classic rock band, but not really, because they can exist in the 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean, their
90s stuff is great.
Yeah, as a high schooler in the 90s, I didn't really know their music, but I knew the star insignia because I knew friends of mine, or I just knew classmates who were into them. And that's how I think I first became aware of them. With a friend of mine, he went on to become an artist. He used to draw the star insignia, the 2112 insignia all the time on everything. And I think he did come over to my house once and tried to get, I think he brought a cassette of, I don't know which album it was, and tried to play it for me. And I was like, nah, it's okay. I don't know if I was into this. I think it's just been when I bought the Columbia records, I'd gotten a bunch, the 12 tapes for a penny, and I was listening to Boston's debut album. So what did I know?
Yeah,
and that's actually not that bad. But.
And Boston is a better example than Aerosmith, but like Boston or even Queen, with the passing of Freddie Mercury, it's like a big part of their catalog is sort of just like set in time. And Rush is so great because they just have this huge arc. And that's kind of why I wanted to be on the Billboard episode, to defend Paramore and Hayley Williams, because clearly you guys are not familiar with, Paramore.
I will admit that I am not the biggest Paramore fan.
Part of it is just the fact that acknowledging that like Hayley Williams was a successful female artist at a time and in a genre of pop punk and like that sort of 2000s indie pop punk rock scene that was very hostile to women. And the fact that the group has been able to, and there's been a lot of shakeups with the rest of the members of the group, and it was like the fact that like her contract that she signed early on was basically a way to lock her in with a group rather than like she's been doing more solo work. But just the idea that like you can make that next turn and make these other kinds of moves, and the sound of, you would love Paramore's last album, and then Hayley has her brand new album, Ego Death at a Bachelorette Party, that is really popular from last year.
Why do I feel like we're going to be doing a Paramore episode sometime?
We might. Listen, I've got a list running. I've got Mystery Science Theater. I want to do X-Files. So we'll toss Paramore on the list too. But just this idea of being able to make multiple turns in your career, I think that is really the sign of resilience for a musician. And then just to bring it back to Rush, like I said with Arrested Development, I think when we go back and look, the fact that they were able to build this fandom at a time when that was not recognized, such that when we start talking about fandom, we're like, oh, well, look at this infrastructure that Rush built starting in 1975. Like, you don't recognize how impressive that is until you have the way to talk about it, which we have now.
I mean, do you see any bands, more recent bands, or even bands of the last 20 years that compare to in fandom wise what Rush has done?
I mean, that's the thing, is that it's like you have to look at the time element of it, and I don't think any other bands from 1975 have that. Um, I have a list of bands that I'm going to share in a minute, and I think maybe somebody like Tool or Primus. Um, but I really think that Rush is such a unique situation. And I think that maybe because it appeals to, like when you think, like when you see Rush played in a TV show, like, are you a King of the Hill fan?
I mean, I know it. I dipped in and out of it. I'm
Okay,
not the
so I'm
biggest
coming
huge
on
fan.
for that one too. So there's a King of the Hill episode where Bobby gets in with a group of guys who are practicing witchcraft. David Cross is in that one.
Okay.
Bobby goes down into the dude's basement and they're listening to the trees.
Okay.
So it's like, because Rush has always been associated with like dudes in basements, which I'll just point out we're doing right now.
Exactly.
Like I think that maybe part of that was sort of undersold. But I think that, I mean, Taylor Swift is the first thing that comes to mind in terms of like building it. But again, I think part of that was just being much more sophisticated. Um, MySpace was certainly a way that groups were building their fan communities at that time, but I cannot think of a group that organically did what they did over this long of a period of time.
That was exactly, I was gonna say theirs was so much more organic just
Hmm.
because they didn't have those
Had to be,
tools at
yeah.
theirs. Yeah, they didn't have those tools at their disposal. And you would think that, and maybe bands have tried. I think that, as you said, because people didn't really realize it until the 2000s and the 2010s that, oh, Rush is still here and people are really into them. It was too late for some other bands that maybe had been contemporaries of them to try to steal that formula.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of other groups from their, age bracket have sustained themselves and have been as musicality first as Rush has been.
Yeah.
A lot of those groups, like, they were successful, but they were successful for a time. Um,
Or a band like, and I keep bringing it up, Kiss, which I don't think you think of musicality with Kiss, but you think of
no.
merchandising,
Yes.
that's not that's. I would say if you have Rush on this side with musicality and just fan friendliness, you have Kiss as the polar opposite. That is basically all merchandising and style over substance, and
You're
I think,
100% right.
yeah.
Yeah, you're 100% right. Like, I think they are the closest analog.
But
And
even Kiss, I think Rush is still, as we just brought up, you can listen to an album by Rush in 2007 and say, I like what they're doing. They still seem to be pushing forward and trying new things, whereas Kiss will just put out a live 7 and record in a studio and add live audience sound effects in the background and say, here's another live album by us, and go buy our comic book that was drawn with our own blood.
yeah, I think that's what it is that, it's certainly the craft is not the same, but in terms of like building a successful IP, Kiss did something that nobody else was capable of
Yes.
doing. I'm not a big fan of theirs either, but yeah, it definitely, I think that is the other
It's the
comparable use
It's
case.
the dark
Yeah.
side of the
Hmm.
coin. Now, I do want to ask, as a Rush fan, and as you brought up, since we waited so long to finally be able to record this episode, Rush is coming back. They will be back this year with a new drummer. How do you feel about that as a Rush fan?
I am excited. Um, it started out where, and I think this is just a, sort of a component of where we are with live performances at this point in history. The tickets were very, very expensive, and they sort of rolled them out in a weird way.
Mm.
Um, it looks like the ticket prices have gone down significantly. Um, I'm trying to work out when I'm going. Um, I think if I hear a lot of, I'm interested to see what sort of the early reviews coming in are. Um, but it's sort of like the parable of the prodigal son. It's like I am so ready to celebrate them coming back, that it's like I don't want to, quibble over what is done. I want to celebrate. And we need reasons to celebrate.
We definitely do. To bring it back to the fandom aspect, how do you feel? Because you're probably more on the pulse of this than I am. All I did was just read articles when it first came out and did think that, oh, we're supposed to be doing this episode and now we have a whole new angle to talk about. But what are the reactions of the fans? Are they excited? Are they skeptical?
I think they run the gamut, but I think for the most part, I mean, a lot of it is like, does this mean we get new songs, new music? But I think we're still a ways out from the first round of performances. They've always put a huge degree of showmanship into their work. There's a genuine question of like, I mean, the concerts used to be 3+ hours long with no opener. It's like, are there going to be opener? Like, are they going to structure it in a way where Alex and Geddy have a little bit more breaks in between? It's going to be interesting, but it's just so early on. I think people are still kind of like excited more than like, oh, or like, we're still kind of in like the honeymoon phase.
Well, it's first of all, Neil Peart, more than most bands, is so. I mean, any drummer is integral to a band, but and we keep bringing this back to Aerosmith. You could bring it back to one of my other favorite bands growing up was Pearl Jam. They're almost like Spinal Tap. They've gone through 3 or 4 drummers, and I'm not saying it's not important to have a good drummer, but it doesn't matter to me who their
Well,
drummer is. But Neil Peart is
he was
the
also a
main
songwriter.
songwriter.
Yep.
It was the trio, and we keep bringing up musicianship. They are truly an organic type of band where they're playing off of each other, and all 3 are so important to the music that's being made, especially if when it's being played live. So that is why it's not just, oh, Aerosmith is going out on tour again, but they don't have Joey Kramer, who's their drummer. They kicked him out. They're just gonna have somebody else. If you're a really a big fan, I don't think it's gonna stop you from going. But I'm sure there's Rush fans who, like any other fandom, are going to say, well, I'm not going to go because this isn't really Rush. Neil Peart's not there.
Yeah, and I just saw the other day where I don't know necessarily that he was approached, but Mike Portnoy, the drummer for Avenged Sevenfold, former Dream Theater drummer, had said that he is glad that he's not doing it because there would have been such high expectations for him. I think if people were wish casting who would take over, out of the blue 10 years ago, I think Mike probably would have been. I mean, he's the only person with a drum kit as big as Neil's.
Well, I think I'm thinking about it now as you're talking about it. I think the only other band, other than the Beatles, if this was the 70s and the Beatles were getting back together, but I think the only other band, Led Zeppelin, has famously, when John Bonham died, I think they were smart and said, we can't go on as a band without John Bonham, so we're done as a band. Now they've reunited at various times. The last time was at the Atlantic Records 40th anniversary 16 years ago, I believe. And luckily for them, John Bonham had a son, Jason Bonham, who can come and drum. But it's not the same. If they had decided, okay, we're going out on tour and we're going to be Led Zeppelin, I think it would have been weird. Even if it was Jason Bonham and he's John Bonham's son, it's still not John Bonham. And I think that's why I thought when Neil Peart passed away that Rush will never get back together, or they would do something famously Robert Plant and Jimmy Page in the 90s did Plant and Page, which it's fine. I mean, you want to put product out there. Maybe Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson would have done something and called it Lifeson Lee or something like that. So they're specifically going out as Rush,
Mm-hmm.
and it is big shoes to fill, as I just brought up. It's not just, okay, we have a new drummer and nobody cares. This fans especially are going to care who the drummer is because of the legacy that Neil Peart has.
Yeah, and I'm excited. They posted some videos of the new drummer, and she's incredible. So it's like it's not a technical thing or anything like that. I think everybody is excited to be proven right, and we'll see. I'm excited to read the first reviews as they come in for the show. I'm really excited.
It's not a one-to-one comparison. I remember reading in the 80s when Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were at each other's throats. They were getting ready to break up, and Keith Richards actually thought about bringing in a new lead singer for the Rolling Stones, to which I thought, how, if you can't have the Rolling Stones without Mick Jagger. You can't have the Rolling Stones without Keith Richards. You can have the Rolling Stones without Bill Wyman. You can have it without Brian Jones, famously. You can even have it without Charlie Watts, although I'd argue now it's like kind of time for them to hang it up. But I can't understand how anyone, least of all Keith Richards, would think it would be a good idea to just replace Mick Jagger. And I'm not comparing Mick Jagger to Neil Peart, but it's almost kind of the same. I think that luckily Rush fans seem a little bit more level-headed, so they're kind of in a wait and see type of attitude right now. But yeah, I can never understand how Keith Richards would think that replacing Mick Jagger would work, and I guess we will see if replacing Neil Peart. And when I say replacing, it's not replacing. I don't think that she is coming in thinking, well, I'm the replacement for Neil Peart. I think she would probably, and I haven't read any interviews with her, but I'm sure she would say, I'm honored to be doing this, and I just hope that I can represent what he wanted. She's not coming in to replace him.
Yeah, and that's the sentiment that they've gone with so far. But before I go, I want to share some songs for people who might, if you're only familiar with Tom Sawyer or Limelight, I've got a cross section of songs, some of them that I've mentioned already.
Before you do it, can I tell you what my favorite Rush? So
yes,
it's not going to be a deep cut. My favorite Rush song is "Closer to the Heart."
Okay,
I just think I can play it over and over again and not get tired of it. And I do find myself going back to. I really, as you brought up, I like that first album. I don't know. You can tell me as a Rush fan if that is blasphemy to say like, oh, you like the first album and Neil Peart's not even on it. I think it's not what you expect from them if you're not the hugest of Rush fan. So it surprised me, but it surprised me how much I liked it, and it's just so different from most of their catalog. So that was the one I could keep on going back to. And maybe it's just me who's more of that 70s type of music that I just found it easier and more accessible. But yeah, that Closer to the Heart and the first album was my favorite.
Well, yeah, because that first album is the closest to, like I talked about, them grinding out shows.
Yep.
It's the closest to that sort of feel that they had. But I want to start with something from, I guess, what would be their second turn, which is as they started to get into the more, orchestral, more epic sort of songs. And I got to go with a fan favorite, Bytor and the Snow Dog.
I was going to bring that. It's so funny because I was going to bring that. And I will not lie, when I saw that title, before I listened to it, I did sigh to myself and say, see, this is what I think. This is what, when I think of Rush, this is what I thought of. I imagine a van driving by with a wizard painted on the side, but it's actually not a bad song.
Yeah. And the story behind it is so funny because they're going to a house party and there's two dogs at the house party, and someone says, oh, be careful, that one's a Bytor. And they just happen to mispronounce the word biter in a funny way, and from that you get a nearly 8-minute, high fantasy epic where two knights are dueling it out at the gates of hell.
Which they have a sequel to on one of the other albums.
Yeah. The Necromancer, Fountains of Lamneth, they build out these characters again from a mispronunciation. So that's what we're dealing with here. Witch Hunt off of Moving Pictures.
Okay.
And if you have any strong reactions to any of these other ones, let me know. Witch Hunt, I'm not going to go too deep into detail on it. I think if people take the time to listen to it, maybe read along with the words, it has a lot of painful resonance to the current moment. It's one of those songs that I think does a great job of articulating a lot of the sort of recurring issues that we have as a society. You hear the music, or you hear this sort of like sound effect of a mob at the beginning of the song that is sort of meant to give the image of, townspeople with pitchforks and torches. That sound was actually recorded by people marching in the streets the night that John Lennon was shot.
Yeah.
And then was recontextualized to be the start of this song, Witch Hunt.
And I will say, before you get to the other songs, Neil Peart, the main lyricist for Rush, and I can joke around and with some of the more sword and sorcery kind of songs, and they're fun, and I'll joke around about it. But I will say that Neil Peart was someone who was very interested and didn't just read Lord of the Rings and say, okay, I'm going to write about Gollum, or I'm going to write about I'm going to write about Gandalf. He was somebody who did look into philosophy and was into studying different religions and studying different world cultures, and did try to bring these ideas into his lyrics. And I will say, there's sometimes they can be very on the nose, and this is just me, and Rush can sometimes come off as a very unironic band. But it's not for lack of wanting to articulate these bigger ideas. And I give them and I give Neil Peart credit for that.
Yeah, and Neil has a strain of libertarianism that runs through a lot of his lyrics.
Yes.
So that's how you end up with, like, the, Bernie voters and the libertarians both at the same concert. But yeah, but again, I also think that he's one of those people where it's like, he is truly one of the best people on the planet to ever live at what he does. And so for him, it's like, well, of course, this kind of makes sense in that context. But Time Stands Still is a song from Hold Your Fire, 1987.
That's a really good song. I think I had heard that before, so that was one of those ones that when I heard it, I was like, oh, this was Rush? I didn't even realize this was Rush.
There was a period in my life where whenever something good or a major, milestone in my life or something would happen, I would listen to that song. And so I associate it with a lot of the best moments of my life, which is something that I've done because...
And that's always good with music. That I mean, that's one of the things that music can always be a kind of timestamp, or just a way. It's almost like with certain smells. When certain smells bring you back to something, songs or albums can bring you back to a certain time or certain events. So that's always great.
And then also off of Hold Your Fire is Lock and Key. And this is just that my good friend Byron, I was trying to get him into Rush. He was not a Rush fan. And one day out of the blue, we're playing video games and he IMs me and he says, it's like, oh, I'm listening to Lock and Key. It's such a great song. I'm like, yes.
I was going to say, isn't that great when you try to get friends or family? I mean, I have, my kids, my son especially, or my daughter. I keep bringing this up on every podcast episode, but we just got done watching all of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I actually have an episode that's going to be coming out about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But to say to her, hey, let's watch this, just the first episode and see what you think, and then to have her come to me and say, can we watch the next one? It's always, or my son bringing up Rush and Sword and Sorcery, going to see the re-release of Lord of the Rings, and he'd watched them before when he was younger, but to go and see Fellowship and then at the end to say, are you okay? Did you like it? And he's like, yeah, can we go to next week when they re-release the next one? And I'm like, yes, we can.
Yeah, but just what I love is that it's like, it's such a deep cut of a track, but like that sort of serving as like if if you're getting it hyped for Lock and Key, then you're sold.
Yeah.
And then sort of in the witch hunt vein of songs that are, culturally significant, Nobody's Hero off of Counterparts. That's a song that I think is really, like you talked about them being a very unironic group. I think when they write these sort of like very emotionally vulnerable songs, I think because they're so genuine, it comes across, and it's just like you don't have that sort of detached reserve, or like you fight the impulse to have like what's the word I'm thinking of, like because they're being vulnerable, you interpret it vulnerably, and so I think Nobody's Hero is a great example of that. And that's in that early 90s period as they're transitioning away from the synth heavy stuff into more of the guitar stuff. And then, like I mentioned, Far Cry off of Snakes and Arrows, I feel like them at the height of their powers. Like, such a great song, such a great album, and just like a very, like, a form of progressive metal that I don't think anybody else could pull off. This is a power trio, which is a configuration that does not really exist anymore for music this loud, and the fact that like they can pull it off with Far Cry,
and I think
incredible.
With that album and with their later stuff, like we said, they knew what they could do and they knew what they were good at, and they did not waste that.
No,
they were determined to, as we said, keep on pushing forward, but they knew they were, I mean, as we said with Neil Peart, he knew he was one of the best in the world at what he did. And they might have taken, different lanes where in the 80s it was more synthesizer, like we keep bringing up. But then they saw where music was going in the later 90s and then into the 2000s, and then the guitars come back. And they will lean into that. And they can do it, and it sounds right with them.
Yeah, and at a time when heavy metal guitar music was, fading from sort of the public consciousness, not public consciousness, but like fading from the front lines of popular music. And then I similarly made a band of lists for people to check out. If you're getting into Rush and you're like, well, what else? Because no other band like Rush, but there are other bands that sort of fit a lot of these kind of characteristics.
Yes, kids, this is like Netflix. If you like Rush, you'll like
exactly. Steely Dan, I feel like they do with like a lot of jazz rock what Rush did with progressive rock and progressive metal.
Very much so. I'm very weird with bands. I am somebody who likes these classic bands, but likes their early stuff. Steely Dan, I love their first album. I know their first album back to front. But then with everything else, I'm more of an Apple Steely Dan song list guy where I'll listen to their individual songs and like them a lot. But then I'll try to listen to something like Asia, and it's okay. It's not totally for me.
Asia, top to bottom.
I don't know. I just like Can't Buy a Thrill. I think Can't Buy a Thrill is great, and it doesn't really sound like anything else in their catalog. So I don't know. I'm weird, but yeah, that's a great comparison.
Pretzel Logic?
I do like Pretzel Logic a lot. But yeah, I do think that Steely Dan is what Rush is to that nerd metal. Steely Dan is to nerd jazz. And famously, I don't think Rush is this way, but Steely Dan famously, 10,000 takes of a single guitar lick trying to get the perfect guitar lick. And it's weird though if you look at Steely Dan's some of the people they've worked with, you don't think of Michael McDonald as somebody to come out of Steely Dan, but did backup vocals for a bunch of their stuff before he went on to do the Doobie Brothers. So Steely Dan is, they sit right side by side with jazz and rock and yacht rock. So yeah, and I think their fans are very much like Rush fans in that if you're a Steely Dan fan, you can smell your own, basically.
Hmm.
When you find one of your own, you're like, yes, you like Steely
Hmm.
Dan.
And Donald Fagen. I'm doing next season of my show. I'm doing on the atomic bomb and New Frontiers. I feel like going to be featured in like maybe the first or second episode. I use a lot of music on my show.
That'll
Um,
be a good episode to listen
and
to.
then sort of pairing with Rush and Steely Dan, Blue Oyster Cult. Steely Dan, Rush, and Blue Oyster Cult are groups where it's like if you are only familiar with the hits, then you're like, oh yeah, those groups had like 3 or 4 hits, but it's
Mhm.
like you miss so much of like what they're actually about. I'm a huge Blue Oyster Cult fan, and I mean, they're still putting out new music. Um, and they are sort of like this prototypical or like prototype goth rock group where it's like a lot of the sort of stuff that we might lump them in with they were sort of like 7 to 10 years too early for, and so people just sort of associate with like Don't Fear the Reaper and stuff like that, but they have these incredible like narrative songs and recurring characters, and there's just so much cool like weird stuff to get into. It's a lot of funny, like there's a lot of humor, a lot of just it's a trip, man. Like
You're gonna have
they're
to send me a Blue Oyster Cult kind of
uh,
starter pack,
like a
because
top. Okay,
a lot of the stuff you're talking about, I only know them for "Don't Fear the Reaper" and what's they have one other song.
Burning for You,
Yes,
Godzilla. Yeah,
yes,
those
but
are the ones you'll hear on the.
I've read about them just being like a music and a rock and classic rock nerd. So I've read that the same type of opinions about them. I've just never really
I'll
dove
send
into
you.
their catalog. So
Yeah,
you're gonna have to kickstart my Blue
I'll
Oyster
send you
Cult
like two or three
fandom.
songs, and then you can like get a taste, and you'll be like, okay.
Okay.
Um, and then in terms of just sheer musicality, like the group that I would put closest to Rush in terms of musicianship, Dream Theater. They are a progressive metal band. The rest of these are some form of progressive metal band that formed after Rush and were inspired directly by Rush. Dream Theater is incredible. Like I said, Mike Portnoy, their longtime drummer, uh, was very inspired by Neil. Primus, they toured with Rush in the early '90s. Les Claypool, like his bass playing is very much, inspired by Geddy.
Mhm.
Riverside is a Polish. They're from Europe. They're a progressive metal band similar to Dream Theater. Porcupine Tree, more of like a 2000s sort of iteration, and then Muse. Those were the groups that I kind of rattled off at the end.
Okay.
Any thoughts on any of those?
Well, some of them I've never heard of. So
Okay.
I do know Muse and I do know Primus. It is interesting to think of Primus and Les Claypool, because again, like you said, there's not many bands as much as Neil Peart is known as like their main songwriter, that Geddy Lee is the singer and he's known as one of the better bass players. You don't usually in bands, especially rock bands, you just don't notice the bass player. And that's they make jokes about that it's a joke in rock bands that I mean you don't really notice the bass player. You want to be the lead guitarist or one of the guitar players.
Yeah, you got to be a
So
little bit of a of a of like a nerd to be able to put together those top 10 lists in the first place.
So it's like, how many of these bands do people specifically know who the bass player is?
Mm-hmm.
Rush, and you're going to know Primus. And even Primus is such of its time. I mean, I liked Primus. I'm not going to say, I think I owned one of their albums. I thought it was okay. I couldn't tell you the last time I listened to a Primus album. I think it would have been cool to see them live.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would have been very cool to see them live. And it goes back to the same thing with Rush in that yes, they've sold a lot of albums, but they're never going to be. You're not going to look at Rush when you look at I was just talking about this with my son, where we brought up. think he was getting out of the car and Hotel California was on. And I said, I don't like this song. And he asked me why, because even he knows what Hotel California is as a 14-year-old. And I said, I don't know. I just heard it all the time growing up and I just never liked the Eagles. I said, their greatest hits album is like the second biggest selling album of all time. And he's like, really? And I said, yeah, it just is. I said, do you know who Meatloaf is? And he said to me, no. I said, you've probably heard the song Paradise by the Dashboard Light. And he's like, I think I know what that is, because he drives in the car with me. So he's heard these songs. And I said, his album is one of the biggest selling albums of all time. You're not going to go and find Rush on that list, but they're going to be a band that has existed and has been able to be out there on the road and have people enjoy them and want to see them and want them to get back together and play again, because of the fandom that has grown up around them. And that is, you were bringing up deep cuts and all that kind of stuff. And that's when you know that you're really a true fan. I mean, you haven't even brought up, we didn't bring up 2112, which is like the album, I think, in pop culture that you would probably know them the most by.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
when you're and you know that in fandom also, to bring it back around to what we're talking about with Rush and with fandom in general, is that you're also going to be protective of the thing that you're a fan of. But you're also going to be, when you're a part of that group and in a certain fandom, you're going to, it doesn't always have to be mean, but you could say like, well, I know I'm a true fan because I like this album that nobody else has heard of. And that's what real fans would like. They don't like the one that everybody knows about. But I don't feel, again, as I said, I don't feel like Rush the band and Rush the fandom that has grown around it is like that, because I think it's so unique that it isn't this testosterone-driven Guns N' Roses, we're going to go and pillage your village and then rape all the women. It's more, we're going to go in the back and read books after we're done this concert because we're tired and that's okay. We don't need to go to the after party with Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley.
And I'll just say, somewhere I have an iPod that is all bootleg recordings of live performances, because that's where I'm at, where it's like, I don't want the studio albums, I want the live performances, and I want the ones, that somebody recorded.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm at. That's what it takes for me. But it's so much fun. I love talking about Rush. I love talking about fandom studies. I feel like, don't make it a year before you have me back on.
No,
unless I'm like your most hated guest.
No, I mean, I was gonna say, it's just so funny that we kept talking about it and kept trying to do it, and I've talked about this with other guests. It's like, this is the pitfalls of podcasting. I wish it was my full-time job. It would be great, because then I could set like an actual schedule. But doing this as a hobby, it's awesome because I get to meet people like you and get to talk about interesting things that, now 2 episodes in a row, I might not necessarily be a fan of and not know that much about, and then come out of it and say, hey, now I know a little bit more about that. And hey, there's aspects of this that I actually enjoy and might want to learn more about. But life actually gets in the way, and I would love to be able to podcast every night if I could, but that does not happen. But it was, as I said, fortuitous that we waited a little bit, because I think we got to add a little bit more to it with the announcement that they're going back on the road, and we might have to do it like a Rush part 2 sequel after you see them, and you're gonna have to report back and tell us what the experience was like.
Yeah, for sure.
But until then, this is the time for you to plug your podcast. So please go ahead, tell us why we should be listening to the History on Film podcast.
Yeah, it's the History
on Film. And you should be, by the way, because it's a very good podcast.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Honestly, I feel like the 2 episodes that we've done on here for you have sort of been like the best advertising we could do. I feel like we do our best work when we come into the basement. But it's a wide-ranging history and media studies podcast. I talk to a lot of academics. I talk to journalists. I talk to film creators, documentarians, all kinds of people. And basically, rather than looking at, what's the history of The Godfather, I look at teaching history by using films and media as cultural artifacts. So an episode that we had recently, that I assume will have been out a few weeks by now, is we watched an episode of The X-Files that is about the Vietnam War, but it is about the legacy of the Vietnam War in the 1990s and some of the conspiracy theories and political movements that came out of the war as they were reflected in the 1990s. So we're talking about Vietnam, but we're talking about the legacy of Vietnam as it was being debated in American society in the 15 years after the war had ended, 20 years at that point. So you learn about, like, this random episode of The X-Files, like, what does it actually teach us about history? Quite a lot. And then, we are able to connect that to the past and also to the present moment as well. And we try to have fun while we're doing it. I think it's a fun show. I have a good time.
That was going to be the next thing I was going to say. Yeah, guys, you know what? This entertainment that we watch, it's fun, but you can actually learn stuff from it too. And your podcast does. It's great. I enjoy it a lot just because it's a lot of stuff that I already know about and that I have watched, but then get to see that unique perspective and do realize that, oh, hey, I did kind of realize that. Oh, I want to look deeper into this. So it is a great podcast. It is always interesting. There are always really, really interesting guests on there. And the one that I just listened to was your annual Super Bowl episode. You had a Giants fan on there, but he at least gave respect to Eagles fans. So
yeah, I was going to say.
And we both share a hatred for Dallas, so that's great also. But yes, please, everybody out there, go and listen to the History on Film podcast. It is a great podcast. You will have a great time. And hey, you just might learn something too. Is there any other social media credentials you want to give out?
No,
or
that's
do you want to
just
stay relatively anonymous?
Yeah, just check out the show. That's all. I've got an article I was working on today. I've got a book that's far down the line, but just listen to the show. You can find everything through there.
Yeah, I think that's going to have to be an episode also. When the book comes out, you're going to have to come on and talk about the book also. But yes, on Apple, Spotify, all the reputable podcatchers out there. And as for us, we are now in the thick of season 3. We've had a couple of really cool episodes that have come out by the time you're listening to this, and we're going to have some really great episodes coming out after this also. Ross, I want to thank you again for coming on. I know it took a while. I promise it will not be as long.
I'll record X-Files tomorrow.
I wish I could do tomorrow, but unfortunately, we'll probably be doing more dad taxiing around, and I will give credit to Andy Leyland as the copyright holder on that term. I am now truly a dad taxi. But for me, you can find Pop Culture Basement on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. The YouTube is just the podcast. It's not video of us making weird faces like we do when we're looking at each other recording this. You can look for Pop Culture Basement on Facebook, on Twitter, because I don't call it the other thing because that would be silly, on Blue Sky, and now on Instagram, just under Pop Culture Basement or the Pop Culture Basement podcast. And until the next time that Ross and I actually do get to talk, and hopefully it's not 10 years from now after another final Rush tour, I just want to say that if you're a fan of hard rock, if you're a fan of heavy metal, if you're a fan of pop music, country music, go outside your comfort zone. Try something new. Because much like the History on Film podcast, you might learn something and you might just enjoy it. But until then, Ross, thank you again for being on, and thank you to everybody for listening.
My pleasure. Thanks.
You got it. Bye, everybody.
They're such great guys, and they're such giving people. So I feel very comfortable to talk to them, and they're nice enough to indulge my fanboy type stuff. I got to ask them about, my favorite album and stuff like that. So it was very easy talking to them. Musicians, and I grew up around musicians with my father, and musicians know how to talk to one another, and as long as you sort of stay in that realm, you're okay. If I get too fanboy with them, I could see them getting a little uncomfortable because I start to turn into every guy out in the audience, air drumming along with Neil. But they've held their own torch for a long time, where a lot of people dismissed them and said that they had no value, and including their greatest work had no value by the critical class. Once again, the critical class misses the boat on a very popular band that means a lot to a lot of people. Why? Because the critical class needs to make a band like that their folly to put over some guy with a beard in the basement with his laptop, you know? I think that's all going to change now. I don't think you'll no longer be able to write a band like Rush out of the narrative. You just won't be able to. They're just going to be too big, and they're going to only get bigger. That's the crazy thing. The real bands out there are only going to get bigger, and the bands with the one song aren't going to be able to compete because they're just not going to have enough information. See, with a band like Rush, you've got all these albums you can debate, this period, that period, oh, his voice here, da-da-da, this lyric here. It's a never-ending cloud that's going to morph, and then, of course, let's say the day comes there where they retire, then there'll be the live tapes, and then the DVDs. A band like that has an incredible amount of information which fits perfectly into the social media world. If you're an ass with one song and one idea, you can't go 5 minutes into the social media world, because once that's explored, there's nothing else for you to do. I'm a big Hemispheres fan myself, just because it's so freaking dark. There's this kind of chirpiness to Rush that grates on some people that don't like them. But for me, it's the other side to Rush, that super dark Cygnus stuff. That's where it's like, there's an art band in there, for sure. I mean, if they had not been prog and they'd grown up in a different time, let's say they were a new band right now, I mean, Pitchfork be all over them, because they're strange as